I come to Poland for the first time in my life, and I feel like a sense of, there's really no other word to describe it, a sense of etiquette. Like maybe you feel something similar when you're in town to visit your relatives. I was like, I'm in Poland for the first time. At that point, I thought maybe it was gonna be the only time. I should go to my grandfather's hometown. And so I called my dad and I said, Dad, do you have anything, like an address or any material? Again, I knew nothing about my grandfather's history. He died before I was born. I didn't know anything about him. I'm named after him, so I feel some sort of like a loose emotional attachment, but again, that never got articulated. And he's like, let me call you back. And he called me back a couple hours later. He's like, here's an address. I went through some old documents. Here's an address. And he spelled out an address that was 12 Malachowskiego. I pronounce it with a lot of confidence now, but it took me like 3 years to sort of nail it down. And, I just want to read. And so what I'm going to do is going to read little passages from like a little tour from my story from the book. And so this is the first time I went to the city, which is called Sosnowiec, which is in the southwest of Poland, in a region called Silesia. I took a train from Krakow to Katowice, and then a second train to Sosnowiec. From the train station, I walked toward Malachowskiego. The streets were narrow, potholed, crammed with small, angry cars and recalcitrant streetcars, and canopied by what seemed like thousands of overhead wires. Sosnowiec, I could see, was no one's favorite vacation getaway spot. Sosnowiec was gloomy and worn down, and, in color and spirit, gray. Was I surprised? I don't know. Among American Jews trekking back to the Altenheim, cameras slung around their necks and myth memories ringing in their ears, it's become somewhat of a trope to be surprised by the city your immigrant grandparents grew up in. It's so urban. It's so modern. This is a coddled, storybook, sentimental preconception, but it can be hard to resist. While I hadn't pictured chickens and horses and peasantry, hadn't imagined finding at Malachowskiego 12 a modest but sturdy wooden cottage with a smoking chimney and a secret cellar, still, you can't help it. When you imagine your grandfather's Polish hometown, you imagine, we have been conditioned to imagine, rural, green, quaint, old-worldly, shtetl-ish. Sosnowiec is nothing like that. Sosnowiec isn't a village, isn't a shtetl, and it isn't picturesque. It is a grim, post-industrial city. This is true historically, aesthetically, and atmospherically. The dominant industry in the region for centuries was coal mining, and this can be felt. The city feels grimy, heavy, melancholy. The city feels like a cough. The architecture is low, mean, Soviet, concrete. Most of the buildings were built or renovated after the war and are utilitarian, curveless, a wrung-out gray or beige. And, I visited the building. The first chapter goes on to detail. I went inside. I kind of snuck inside. I felt it. I kind of forced myself into the sentimental moment. I was like, wow, here's where my grandfather grew up. And then I left. And at that point, I had no interest in ever going back. There was no reason to ever go back. Again, my grandfather was a complete blank. There was sort of no questions I was grappling with, and I didn't feel like the need, and like the writers here could really sort of appreciate this, I didn't feel the need to like force myself to have questions about him. And so I really felt like it was like a one-time journey. And then over the next few years, I fell in love with Poland. I loved the place. I found it to have like a sort of an energy that I had not experienced anywhere else, especially as someone sort of researching Jewish history. And I kept going back. And so from 2010 to 2015, I'd go like 2-3 months a year. And I started meeting people who had reclaimed property there. And my father would sort of get after me. He was like, your grandfather owned that building. And we have some weird documentation. You should look into it. And I kept being like, whatever, I don't know. I just kept sort of brushing him off. And eventually he just sort of got after me. And he's like, look, you know people, you have a network, see what you can do about it. And he faxed me. That was maybe the first and last fax I've ever gotten. He faxed me the pages in the summer of 2015. And he sent me this thick sheaf. It was like 60 or 70 pages of documents. He didn't know what it was. It was just like a thick and unorganized collection of documents. And I remember that night is like, my life changed that night. I got these documents from Hotel Eden. If anyone's been in Krakow, it's where all the Jews stay. They have like little mikveh there. No, okay. And so, and I took them over the river to the apartment where I rented, and I stayed up all night, sort of organizing these documents, and they were a mess. There was in 4 different languages. They were in German, they were in Yiddish and English, and something else. Some of them were translations, some of them were translations of translations, some of them had like notaries, some of them had notarized translations. And it took me all night just to organize these documents. And I did, and a story emerged. A story emerged of my grandfather had tried to reclaim this property that had belonged to his father, who'd been murdered in the Holocaust, and had failed. And he had failed for 30 years, from after the war until he died in 1977. And for me, the failure was something, but this was the first thing I could hang my imagination on about my grandfather. I felt in a really real way like I was meeting him. I could see his failure, I could see his frustration, and I felt in a way like, here is my opportunity to at least enter into conversation with my grandfather. And so I was like, you know what? I'm in a place, I have I was lucky enough, and I have the opportunity to sort of pick up where he left off.